Hey, what's up? It's Pat here. There's a lot of hype right now for something brand new that Google launched for podcasters, and that's Google's Podcast Manager. Verge came out with an article here saying Google Podcasts will give podcasters more data about their listeners. So in this video, I wanted to share a little bit with you about, well, what are my first impressions? Let's go in there and actually see what kind of data it's pulling out. And also, just to give you some upfront notice about this, it's kind of lacking a little bit. And I do have a wish list of items. Google, you're watching this? Well, here's what I hope will eventually be included. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Let's dive right in. Google Podcast Manager is meant to give us better stats and more insight on our listeners, which is great because us podcasters, we've been struggling with data. It's nothing like YouTube and all the analytics that we have access to. Essentially, all we have is our podcast host, and that's it, to tell us how many downloads and plays there have been of our show. But we need a lot more. So this is really exciting. It's really great that Google, a giant company with a lot of data, a lot of search engines, can help us get more stuff. And they even recently shared that they want to double the amount of podcast listeners in just a couple years. So this is all really exciting. And I was so hyped up to hear about this. And here on Verge, they even say like how to do it. Like you got to claim your show, and you can even submit your show through it too. Demographic data, all this stuff. That's kind of what was promised, but unfortunately, it's lacking quite a bit. And in fact, we're gonna go here and I'm gonna show you what Google Podcast Manager looks like. I have two of my podcasts in here. They've been in here for a couple weeks now. I had early beta access to this. So you are seeing this, and this is for my show, Ask Pat. Now, one of the big drawbacks about this only shows data from people who listen via Google Podcasts, which is only accounting for 1.6% of all podcast listeners, generally speaking, across the board, because most people are listening on Apple devices right now. And that's kind of unfortunate because here on Google Podcast Manager, it says for this particular show, for the whole show, I've got 231 plays. That's not very good if you just look at those numbers, right? If I go to Buzzsprout, which is where this is hosted, this one episode has 4,101 downloads. Plus, look at all this data I get from my host itself. I get to know what apps they're using, from Apple Podcasts to Stitcher, Overcast, Podcast Addict, CastBox. That gives me some good information. Devices, Apple iPhone, Android iPhone. This is all really good. Categories, countries, cities, all that user data. In Google, I just get a device breakdown, and that's about it. Which is not very good. Now, the one thing that Google will give you is the average length that a person is listening to a show. So that's retention rate. As you can see here, these ones have a retention rate of about 63%, 62%, 70%. So this gives us some good insight in terms of, well, what people are sticking around for, and that's great. However, we often can get this information already. If you're in iTunes Connect through podcast.apple.com, you can get a lot of that same kind of information too. So there's nothing new here yet. There's nothing new here yet. And in fact, it's quite disappointing because they're hyping it up so much, but we know this is the first iteration. And much like everything else Google does, they launch because they want to get user feedback, and I think that's great. The one plus, however, about Google Podcast Manager is that you can now manually submit your podcast. Now, generally speaking, Google Podcasts are meant to use their search engines to then find your show. So you technically don't even need to submit your show to a directory like with Apple Podcast or Spotify or Stitcher or others. Google will use their spiders to find your podcast if it's on your website and automatically include your show in Podcast Manager. However, a lot of times people struggle with that because there's a lot of requirements. And I gotta give a big shout out to James over at podnews.net, who ran a little experiment, and here he's saying that he also has a lot of the same verdicts that I do, right? There's no reach figures, it's quite different, but you can, and he did an experiment where he did submit a test show through Google Podcasts, not even following all the requirements, and it was still able to be found after about 4 days. So you can submit through Google Podcast Manager, and again, the link is podcasts, plural, .manager.google.com. But to finish up, I wanted to share a little bit more about my wish list. So Google, if you're watching this, or if anybody has any sort of say at what happens at Google, I do have a wish list of items that I want to see in podcast stats because it is very, very lacking. And for somebody who does both podcasting and YouTube, it's just night and day in terms of what we have access to. And I got to tell you, the reason why YouTube is so great is because of the analytics. We can understand a lot more about what's going on and thus do a lot more to help better serve our audience, which then can obviously bring more people back into the YouTube space. With podcasting, I think Apple and Google and everybody's kind of working in their own world, and for whatever reason, they're just not delivering on the kinds of stats that we need. So I know this stuff is coming. Google has that power to do a lot of this stuff, but here is my wish list. Number one, more data, right? More data beyond just like listeners and how long they're listening to. We can already get that, obviously. I want to see things like search. What keywords are people using to find and play on websites? I want website data to go along with this. How are they getting to go and find these podcasts? That would be really amazing too. Impressions, click-through rates, much like with search engine results, right? We can now listen to podcasts directly in search results. If you look up my podcast, in fact, if I go to Google, let me just try this live here with you right now. If I go to Google and type in Smart Passive Income Podcast, you're going to see that you can actually play these podcast episodes directly from the Google browser. Cool. What keywords are people using? How long are they listening to those in particular? How many people are finding that and actually clicking play? What are the impression rates, click-through rates? All those sorts of things are very helpful. I also want website data. If this is being played on other people's websites, that would be great too. But we can go even beyond that. I would love some user data in terms of more about the end user, right? Like not just where they're from, but what other shows might they be listening to? That way I can even connect with those other podcasts and see how I might be able to deliver even more value to them or create collaborations. I'd love an open API to be able to get access to this information. And maybe there's somebody else out there who's more bullish on podcasting who can create something even better to pull this information out and better display it for all of us. I would love to see that. In the future, I can imagine even a lot of podcast growth opportunities using this sort of platform of Google and the way that we can all cross-promote each other, much like a AdSense or AdWords sort of ad-based campaign. Why can't I pay you, Google, for example, to get more people to listen to my show? That would be amazing. And Google, you've done this very well, and this is your entire business. Hopefully, we're going to see that in the podcasting space, and I think that would be a huge opportunity for sure. What about retargeting? Can I retarget people with ads, for example, who I know or you know have listened to my show, right? There's so many other things that can happen, and so I'm curious, what's your wish list? If you're watching this video, hopefully you're catching this at the time that this news comes out, and if not, maybe they've already improved it since then, but I'm going to be keeping you up to date on all this stuff. But in terms of your wish list for podcasting, what do you wish was out there already that you don't have access to? If you're part of the community, leave a comment below. I'd love to see what you think, and we can have a discussion about that too. And of course, if any brand new big things come out in the world of podcasting, I talk a lot about podcasting here, in addition to YouTube and blogging and just business in general, but this is big news. But it's not as big as I thought. I'm a little disappointed, but I'm optimistic. What do you think? Let me know in the comment section below. What's your wish list of items? Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. And if you're watching this right now and you want some podcasting help, learning how to monetize your podcast, you can click on this video right here. That'll take you to a very popular video about how to monetize your show. And no, it's not just advertising and sponsorship. Thanks so much. Appreciate you. And we'll talk soon. Boom, we did it.